Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into a topic that's really packed with emotion, with politics, and often a lot of difficult history. Government-enforced group preferences.
That's right.
We're doing a deep dive into Thomas Sowell's really important study, Affirmative Action Around the World. It takes this massive look, based on facts, at something usually just stuck in political arguments.
And that's a really crucial distinction right from the start. Usually when people talk about affirmative action or, any policy that gives advantages based on what group you belong to, the conversation almost always goes straight to intentions or the theory of justice behind it. But Sowell, he deliberately steps back from all that.
Okay.
His work is purely focused on the empirical evidence, the measurable results. He asks, what actually happens when governments put these policies into practice in different countries?
It's such a powerful way to approach it, because it cuts through all the unique stories and histories that every country uses to, justify its own policy. So basically saying, look, forget the good intentions for a second. Let's look at the consistent pattern of what comes out of these things.
Exactly.
And what he finds, looking across different continents, different histories, is this remarkably consistent path, both morally and economically.
Yeah. And the first challenge, honestly, is just pinning down what policies we're even talking about. Because every country insists, our situation is totally unique.
This is different here.
Yes. Our history means we need this specific approach. Sowell points out this passionate claim of national uniqueness happens everywhere these policies pop up. They always say it's only needed because of local history.
But underneath the different names, the policies have really similar features. And crucially, they often lead to very similar outcomes.
It's what Sowell calls a semantic jungle. The same basic idea gets dressed up differently depending on where you are.
So you have affirmative action in the U.S., obviously, but similar ideas get called positive discrimination in Britain and India.
And it keeps going. In Sri Lanka, which we'll definitely get into more detail on later, they called it standardization for university admission. In Nigeria, the framing was about reflecting the federal character of the country, making sure different ethnic groups were represented in government jobs.
Gotcha.
And then you have places like Malaysia and Indonesia where they use that really deep-rooted phrase, sons of the soil.
Bumi Putra. Right.
Precisely. And the irony, Sowell points out, is that this very claim of uniqueness, whether it's about the Maori in New Zealand or the Dalits, the untouchables in India, or Black Americans in the U.S., that claim itself is actually a common global pattern.
Huh. So the insistence on being unique is universally common.
Pretty much. The same kinds of mechanisms are at play everywhere, just hidden behind these local justifications. So the core mission for us in this deep dive, following Sowell's analysis, is really to examine his big finding, that no matter the local history or the specific reason given, these programs tend to follow a consistent path that often actually undermines the justice and unity they were supposed to create. We're focused on consequences, not hopes.
Right. Let's unpack that consistency then. Maybe starting with what Sowell sees as this fundamental illusion of control over these programs.
Yes. One of the most persistent myths, politically speaking, around group preferences is that they're temporary. They're almost never sold as permanent fixtures.
No, they're always pitched as temporary, transitory.
Exactly. Just a short-term fix needed to correct some specific historical wrong. That's the political sales pitch.
Yet the reality, looking at the data, they stick around and they grow. They last decades past their supposed end dates.
It seems the political energy needed to end an entitlement program is just much weaker than the forces pushing to keep it going and even expand it.
We see that everywhere Sowell looked, right?
Absolutely. In India, leaders initially suggested just a 10-year limit for reservations for untouchables, partly to, quiet down political opposition. Decades and decades ago, it's proven politically impossible to actually end them.
In Pakistan is an even more striking example.
Oh, definitely. Preferential policy started there back in 1949, explicitly temporary, set to phase out in 5, maybe 10 years.
Okay.
The main group they were meant to help, the very poor Bengali population in what was then East Pakistan. But those policies just kept getting extended again and again for decades past the cutoff. And here's the really wild part. Even after East Pakistan broke away and became Bangladesh in 1971, the policies continued in West Pakistan. They just found other political groups to support them and keep them alive.
Wow. So the policy outlived its main goal, its main beneficiaries, and even the country it was originally designed for.
Pretty much. That shows you this incredible, almost like parasitic ability to survive politically.
It's not just how long they last that gets out of control, though. It's also the scope, right? What they cover.
Yes, exactly. Policies that started out limited, focused on one specific area, proved just as hard to contain. They ended up expanding into areas they were explicitly told not to touch.
Like in academia. You mentioned academic creep.
Yeah, take India again. A government minister initially said, okay, lower admission standards for universities for untouchables, fine, but explicitly no lowering of standards for passing courses or grading.
The idea being, get more people in the door, but make sure they're actually competent when they come out.
Right. Maintain the standards of competence, but that line just couldn't hold in reality.
Why not? What happens?
Well, if you admit students who are significantly less prepared than their peers, they're going to fail at much higher rates. That's almost inevitable.
Yeah, that causes political problems.
Huge political problems. Backlash, new demands. So, institutions start finding ways around it. In Malaysia, for instance, grades for Malay students often have to go through an evaluation committee that's heavily weighted with Malay representatives. Faculty have reported having grades just changed unilaterally, for ethnic balance. In India, it often takes the form of grace marks, just extra points added to the scores of students from preferred groups.
Arbitrary points.
Pretty much. And in the US, we saw the rise of things like affirmative grading practices, basically designed to avoid the high failure rates that this mismatching causes.
Oh, and we saw a similar kind of uncontrolled expansion in the U.S. job market, didn't we? With the term affirmative action itself.
Absolutely. It started with JFK's executive order, which was really about ensuring non-discrimination based on individual merit. The focus was equal opportunity.
So judging each person on their own qualifications.
Yes. But then, under Presidents Johnson and Nixon, the whole concept really shifted, metastasized.
How so?
It started incorporating these crucial phrases like goals and timetables, and most importantly, representation.
Representation. That sounds like numbers.
Exactly. Affirmative action quickly turned into a numbers game, focused on statistical parity. Defining discrimination or underutilization, basically by whether a company had fewer minorities than you'd statistically expect based on the local population, regardless of intent or actual discriminatory actions.
Okay, so this focus on numbers, on statistical parity, brings us to what Sowell identifies as this impossible goal that seems to underpin all these policies, the myth of group parity.
Right. The unspoken goal, pretty much everywhere, seems to be achieving roughly equal representation. Groups should be represented in jobs, universities, etc., in proportion to their share of the overall population.
And Sowell says that's just not achievable.
He argues it's an impossible target. He calls it an internal goal because that kind of perfectly even representation across all fields and groups has been a very rare or non-existent phenomenon throughout history, across all cultures.
So the whole political promise of reaching parity is based on a faulty assumption.
Yes. The assumption is that if you just remove discrimination, all groups would naturally end up evenly represented everywhere.
But history doesn't show that at all.
Quite the opposite. Sowell provides tons of examples of huge disparities that existed before any preferential policies came along, and often where discrimination wasn't the obvious cause.
Like what? Give us an example.
Okay, think about Tsarist Russia. About 40% of the army's high command came from the German minority, who are only about 1% of the population.
Wow, 40% from 1%.
Or look at Malaysia again. At one point, nearly half the pilots in the Malaysian Air Force were ethnic Chinese, way above their share of the population.
Why would that happen?
It happens because of all sorts of complex factors, differences in historical migration patterns, cultural emphasis on certain skills or education, geography, specialization. It's not usually just about discrimination.
Like his example of German brewers.
Exactly. Germans ended up dominating the beer industry in the US, China, South America, not because of some global conspiracy, but because they had the brewing skills and the migration networks.
Or specialized trades, like clothing manufacturing.
Right. Jewish communities often predominated in that field. Medieval Spain, the Ottoman Empire, later in the US and other places. They brought specific skills, maybe different educational norms, or historical experiences that gave them an edge in that particular industry.
So the core point here is, if your temporary policy is designed to achieve a goal, perfect group parity that has basically never happened anywhere naturally.
Then that policy isn't really temporary at all, is it? It's basically set up to be permanent. The goal itself guarantees the program never has a reason to end, which keeps group identity politically charged forever.
Okay, so we've got policies that are meant to be temporary but become permanent, meant to be limited but expand endlessly, chasing an impossible goal. What are the actual sort of on-the-ground consequences of this, especially morally?
This is where Sowell's findings get really consistent and maybe the most damning. He calls it elite capture.
Elite capture, what does that mean?
It means the benefits of these preferential policies, the jobs, the university spots, the scholarships, they overwhelmingly go to individuals within the preferred groups who are already the least disadvantaged, the ones who are already better off.
But wait, that completely undermines the whole argument for the policy, right? Isn't it always sold as helping the poorest, the most marginalized?
Almost always. That's the public rationale, the moral justification helping the truly downtrodden, correcting deep historical wrongs for the people at the bottom. But the evidence consistently shows the opposite happens.
Across different countries.
Yes. Look at India. In the state of Tamil Nadu, you have these legally defined backward classes who are eligible for preferences. Sowell found that the highest group within those backward classes, making up just 11% of that preferred population, got almost half of all the reserved jobs and university spots.
Half the benefits went to the top 11% of the target group.
Almost half, yeah. The group that was already closest to the mainstream captured the lion's share of the benefits.
That's a stark inversion. And you see this elsewhere.
Same pattern in Malaysia. Preferences there are for the indigenous Malay majority against the Chinese and Indian minorities. Sowell found that Malay students whose families were in the top 17% of the national income distribution got just over half of all the scholarships given to Malays.
So scholarships meant to level the playing field actually ended up boosting the kids from the wealthiest Malay families.
Dramatically so. And again, in Sri Lanka, preferences for university admission were given to students from designated backward regions. But who benefited most?
Let me guess. Not the poor kids from those regions.
Nope. It was mostly students from the most affluent families within those backward regions. They were the ones who had the necessary background, the better primary schooling, the resources to actually succeed once they got that preferential admission.
So why does this happen? If the goal is to help the poor, why not just means test these programs? Limit them to people below a certain income level. So Sowell must address why that seemingly obvious solution is almost never chosen.
He suggests a couple of main reasons. First, it's about political effectiveness. The elites within any group, preferred or not, tend to be the most organized, the most politically active, the most vocal.
They're the ones who know how to work the system.
They're the ones who show up, who lobby, who demand the benefits. Second, it's also about efficiency, in a way. Elite capture isn't always about straightforward corruption like bribes. It's often just more efficient for the system.
How is it more efficient for the benefits to go to the wrong people?
Well, think about it. Getting preferential access, say, to a university is just one piece of the puzzle for success. You also need what economists call complementary factors, like already having a decent prior education, family stability, maybe professional connections, even just the cultural know-how to navigate the institution. People who are already better off usually have more of these complementary factors.
So they're just better positioned to actually use the preference once they get it. They can convert the opportunity into real success more easily.
Exactly. They're sort of pre-primed to succeed once the door is open to crack for them, even if the policy was theoretically aimed at someone much further behind.
So the policy ends up, as Sowell puts it, borrowing legitimacy from the promise to help the very poor.
Yes, it gets political support based on that promise.
But the way it actually works ensures the benefits flow mostly to the elites within the group.
Precisely. And this does a couple of damaging things. It distorts the history, making it seem like these policies are crucial for group uplift when the benefits are concentrated. And it weakens the genuine commitment to helping the truly poor. The focus shifts from poverty itself to just group entitlement.
And the benefits end up going to people who might not even be significantly worse off than people in the non-preferred groups.
Which guarantees political resentment and ensures the policies just keep going, long after any real justification based on deep disadvantage has faded.
Okay, beyond just who gets the benefits, Sowell also talks about how the very existence of these entitlements changes how people behave, right? Their incentives.
Yes, this is another really corrosive effect. When you know you can get certain outcomes, a job, a promotion, a university spot, based on your group identity rather than your skills or effort, it naturally weakens the incentive to develop those skills.
Why bother working as hard if the outcome is sort of guaranteed?
Basically, it can act as a substitute for achievement. Sowell found evidence of this kind of complacency all over the world. He quotes a Nigerian writer who actually lamented the tyranny of skills.
The tyranny of skills?
Yeah, recognizing that actual professional competence was becoming less important than just having the right ethnic background for representation.
It fosters this mindset where merit itself is seen as optional or even unfair.
It can, yeah. He mentions an Indian leader promoting preferences who actually asked, "Are we not entitled to jobs just because we are not as qualified?" That's a pretty direct statement of the mindset. And in Malaysia, reports suggested Malay students sometimes felt less pressure to perform because they felt their future jobs or positions were basically assured due to preferences.
And in the U.S.,
Sowell cites accounts of Black college students aiming for grad school who apparently showed little concern about their academic preparation because they just believed certain rules would simply be set aside for them.
That's maybe the saddest part, this institutionalized layering of expectations. It convinces people that their group label matters more than their actual abilities.
It's a potential tragedy, yeah. And the cost isn't just to the individual's own development. It affects the quality of work across the board, and it damages the identity and reputation of everyone in the preferred group, even those who succeeded entirely on merit.
How so? How does it damage reputation?
Well, think about collaboration in a workplace or university. It gets seriously undermined when people suspect that their colleagues got there or got promoted based on group preference rather than ability.
It creates this cloud of doubt.
A pervasive doubt and, frankly, disrespect. Sowell gives examples. Minority professors on U.S. campuses complaining they have less intellectual interaction with colleagues because they're perceived as affirmative action hires.
That's a terrible label to carry, undermining their authority.
Absolutely. Or think about policing, where trust and competence are literally life and death matters. He mentions Black police sergeants in Chicago who were promoted over white officers who had scored higher on exams.
What happened?
When they made mistakes on the job, they were openly taunted by colleagues as, quote, "a sergeants." The policy itself created the conditions for that disrespect, poisoning the work environment. It damages not just the individual standing, but the perceived standards of the whole profession.
So if the incentives to develop skills are weakened, what about the incentives for basic honesty?
That's another major area Sowell explores. Preferential policies create powerful incentives for people to, well, fudge their identity to qualify for benefits.
You mean people pretending to be part of a group they're not really connected to?
Or exaggerating a distant connection? Look at the U.S. Census data for American Indians. It's just statistically impossible. The number of people identifying as American Indian in one specific age group, those aged 15 to 19 in 1960, increased by over 60% by the time that same group was counted in the 1980 census.
Wait, the same group of people grew by 60% in 20 years? That can't happen biologically.
Exactly. It can only happen if huge numbers of people, likely with some distant or mixed ancestry, decided to redesignate themselves as American Indian specifically to take advantage of the growing benefits and preferences available.
That's incredible. Purely driven by policy incentives. And this isn't just a U.S. thing.
Not at all. Similar patterns in Australia with the Aboriginal population, a 42% jump between two censuses in the 80s. Again, biologically impossible. Clearly driven by redesignation due to subsidies and preferences. But maybe the most mind-boggling example is from China in the 1990s. Over 10 million Han Chinese, the dominant ethnic group, suddenly declared themselves members of minority groups.
10 million? Why would they do that?
Benefits. Lower scores needed for college admission was a big one. But also, crucially, exemptions from China's extremely strict birth control policies, like the one-child policy.
You're kidding. Millions of people were claiming to be ethnic minorities just to have more kids or get into college easier.
People were apparently tracing their family trees back centuries, trying to find any ancestor who belonged to a minority group, all to get these government-granted advantages.
That just shows how powerful these incentives are. People will rationally respond to the rules, even if it means, well, bending the truth about who they are. It completely undermines the moral idea behind the preferences.
It proves that when you attach benefits to a group label, the label itself becomes the valuable thing, not the underlying identity or disadvantage. And this leads straight into outright economic fraud, too.
Like the Alibaba businesses. Explain that.
Right. Alibaba Enterprises. It's a term used mostly in Malaysia and Indonesia. Ali is the local indigenous person, the Malay or Indonesian, who is legally eligible for preferences, like special government contracts or subsidized business loans.
Okay, that's Ali. Who's Baba?
Baba is usually the non-indigenous person, often ethnically Chinese, who actually has the business expertise, the capital, the connections.
So what happens?
Ali basically acts as a front. He lends his name and his legally privileged status to the business for a fee, while Baba runs the whole thing behind the scenes.
So the benefit, which was supposed to help the indigenous Ali start a business, actually just gets siphoned off by Baba, the controller. Ali just gets a small cut for lending his name.
Exactly. It's essentially renting out ethnic privilege. So Mal notes similar schemes have been found in the U.S. with minority set-aside programs in Africa. It happens wherever these kinds of preferences exist.
And the effect is?
It increases costs for everyone, it undermines legitimate minority-owned businesses that are trying to compete on merit, and it funnels the policy benefits away from the intended group entirely, often into the hands of people who are just gaming the system.
It's clear how these policies drift far from their original goals, expanding who benefits from the initial target groups to, say, white women in the U.S., or recent immigrants who have no connection to the historical disadvantage, or people just claiming a tenuous ancestry.
Yes, the boundaries become incredibly blurry.
But maybe the most devastating consequence, so big to document, is how politicizing these group differences leads down a path toward actual conflict, serious conflict.
This is really where his research sounds the loudest alarm bell. He argues that the resentment these policies create isn't just about losing out on a job or a university spot. It's deeper than that.
What's it about, then?
It's fundamentally about the principle behind the transfers. It's the rejection of impartial rules, the rejection of individual merit as the basis for how society allocates scarce resources.
He makes an interesting contrast with Asian Americans in the U.S., right?
Yes, it's a striking point. He notes that high-achieving Asian Americans, through sheer academic merit, displaced far more white students in top universities than black students admitted under affirmative action did.
But you didn't see the same level of political backlash against Asian Americans.
Generally, no. Because their success, while maybe resented by some individuals who lost out, was widely seen as earned through hard work and achievement. The anger and resentment really targets the principle of unequal standards, of treating people differently based on group identity, not just the fact of group success itself.
And where has this abandonment of impartial rules led to the most dangerous outcomes?
India, with its very long history of caste-based reservations, is a prime example of lethal polarization. It's become tragically common, with intense violence erupting between castes and groups fighting over these reserved positions.
The violence can be over tiny numbers of spots, right? Like the medical school example.
It's shocking. He details riots in the state of Gujarat where 42 people were killed, the trigger. Just 7 reserved places in medical schools for untouchables. 7 spots.
42 deaths over 7 seats. Is Sowell saying it's just the scarcity, or is it the principle again?
He argues it's the principle. The scarcity is just the flashpoint. When the government says justice means dividing spoils based on group identity, every single allocation becomes a high-stakes political battle between groups. It turns neighbors against each other.
And the violence wasn't just isolated incidents.
No, it escalated nationally against untouchables, even though Sowell estimates only about 6% of untouchable families actually benefited directly from the preferences. This suggests the anger was really aimed at the system of group privilege itself.
And this politicization of identity also fuels extremist movements.
Absolutely. Movements like Shiv Sena in Maharashtra became powerful political forces largely by campaigning for preferences for local Maharashtrians against people they labeled outsiders, Muslims, South Indians.
And they weren't just political parties. They acted like militias.
They were implicated in large-scale riots, arson, even murder, targeting these designated outsider groups. The reports from the Bombay riots in the early 90s are just horrific.
What happened there?
Officially, over 1,000 people were killed. There were accounts of neighbors turning on longtime friends, leading them to be killed simply because of their ethnic or religious classification. Once the government legitimizes dividing people by group for benefits, it can unleash absolute horror.
That's terrifying. But Sowell points to Sri Lanka as perhaps the most catastrophic example of this dynamic, a country that started out relatively peaceful.
Yes, Sri Lanka is a truly tragic case study. In 1948, at independence, it was seen as an oasis of stability, peace, and order.
So what went wrong? How did preferences play a role?
It shows how quickly things can unravel when the state starts playing favorites between groups. The Tamil minority had historically done well in education and certain professions.
Better than the Sinhalese majority in some areas.
Yes, for historical reasons, they held a disproportionate number of spots in medicine, government service, etc. For example, they were 44% of doctors in 1946, despite being a much smaller percentage of the population.
And Sinhalese leaders used this disparity politically.
They framed it as an injustice that needed urgent correction through state action. This led to policies like the Sinhala-only language law, making it harder for Tamils in government jobs. And critically, they introduced preferential university admissions for Sinhalese students by lowering the required academic standards for them. They called it standardization.
Lowering standards for one group but not another.
Exactly, unequal rules. The Tamils initially protested peacefully against these policies.
But the protest didn't work.
They failed, and that failure was crucial. It led things down a path first to organized mob violence against Tamils, who are now effectively second-class citizens.
What were the consequences?
The consequences were decades of brutal civil war. The anti-Tamil riots in 1983 were horrific, maybe up to 3,000 Tamils killed. Huge numbers became refugees inside their own country. Sowell meticulously traces how government favoritism, replacing equal individual treatment with group privilege, just completely destroyed national unity.
It paved the road to war.
Directly. It set the stage for organized guerrilla movements, horrific atrocities on both sides, a conflict that tore the country apart for 25 years.
And Nigeria provides another angle on this with its federal character principle.
Yes, a somewhat different mechanism, but a similar result. The policy stated that government jobs and projects had to reflect the federal character of the country.
Which basically meant ensuring representation for the major ethnic groups, also Fulani, Igbo, Yoruba.
Right, and ironically, this was put in place supposedly to reduce ethnic tension.
But it did the opposite.
It institutionalized the tension. It made control of the central government the ultimate prize, because whichever ethnic bloc held power could then use the federal character policy to distribute jobs, money, and projects overwhelmingly to its own group and region.
So every government appointment, every contract became part of this intense, zero-sum political game between ethnic groups.
Exactly. The government essentially wrote into law the idea that resources should be divided along ethnic lines, not based on merit, need, or efficiency. Sowell argues this directly fueled the tensions that exploded into the Biafran Civil War.
So his conclusion across all these cases, India, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, is consistent.
Chillingly consistent. It wasn't the mere existence of group disparities that caused the conflict. It was the state stepping in and politicizing those disparities through preferential policies. That was the catalyst for polarization and, tragically, for violence.
The findings on conflict are just staggering. But Sowell's research also pulls back the curtain on a kind of political mythology that surrounds these policies, especially in the U.S. context.
Yes, a really key finding is how governments consistently took credit for social progress that was actually already happening, sometimes quite rapidly, before affirmative action policies were even put in place.
Particularly regarding Black advancement in the U.S.
The data he presents here is probably one of the most controversial parts of the book because it challenges the standard narrative so directly. We really need to look at the poverty numbers he highlights.
Okay, what do they show?
The poverty rate among Black families in the U.S. fell dramatically between 1940 and 1960, from 87% down to 47%.
Wow, an 87% poverty rate in 1940. That's immense.
It was. But the point is, it dropped by 40 percentage points before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the affirmative action policies that followed in the late 60s and 70s.
So what was driving that huge drop in poverty?
According to Sowell and the data he uses, it was primarily self-reliance, rising education levels among Black Americans, and the great migration out of the segregated, economically depressed South into industrial jobs in the North and West, people lifting themselves up.
And this trend held for higher-level jobs, too.
Yes, he shows the biggest jump in Black Americans entering professional, technical, and other skilled occupations actually happened in the years leading up to the 1964 Act.
Okay, so massive progress before 1964. What happened after affirmative action was established, say, in the 1970s?
During that decade, when affirmative action was in full swing, the Black family poverty rate fell by only one more percentage point. Just one.
40 points of decline before, 1 point during the main affirmative action decade.
That's the statistical picture Sowell presents. The vast majority of the progress came from individual and community efforts, driven by expanding opportunities in a growing economy, but the political narrative became that affirmative action was the essential driver.
And why is that myth damaging, according to Sowell?
Well, for a couple of reasons. It fosters resentment among whites because it frames advancement as something given by the government, often at their expense rather than earned. And perhaps more importantly, it obscures the incredible history of Black self-reliance and achievement against enormous odds.
It basically attributes the success of people lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps to government policy instead.
Exactly, which, ironically, can weaken the very virtues, hard work, education, resilience that actually produced that initial success.
Okay, let's shift to another really damaging unintended consequence that pops up globally, especially in universities: the problem of mismatching.
Right. This is where preferential admissions policies systematically place students into academic environments where they are significantly less prepared than the average student there. Even if that student might have been perfectly qualified, even starred, at a good but less hyper-selective institution.
So it's not about the student being unqualified in an absolute sense.
Often not. It's about being placed in a setting where the pace and competition are just overwhelming compared to their level of preparation. Sewell credits Professor Clyde W. Summers with predicting this pervasive shifting effect way back.
What was Summers' argument?
He basically said, look, take a minority student who gets into Harvard with, say, lower scores than the average Harvard student due to preference. That same student might have thrived, been a top student at a solid state university like Rutgers or Illinois.
But at Harvard.
At Harvard, they're suddenly competing against students mostly drawn from the top 1-2% nationally. They're academically mismatched, and through no fault of their own, they're statistically much more likely to struggle or fail. The preference artificially turned a potential success into a likely failure.
And the data Sowell presents bears this out.
Tragically, yes. At UC Berkeley, for example, the average SAT scores of Black undergraduates admitted under preference were actually above the national average. These were capable students, but their scores were significantly below the average for white and Asian students at Berkeley, which is an extremely selective school. The result: around 70% of those mismatched Black students failed to graduate from Berkeley.
70%. It's devastating. These are students who are qualified for good universities, but put in a situation almost designed for them to fail.
Similar high failure rates were observed at places like San Jose State. And the fallout isn't just academic failure, which is a huge waste of potential in itself.
What else happened?
It breeds resentment, lowers self-esteem, and often leads to intense pressure to erode academic standards across the board. Students feel demoralized, maybe angry, and their focus can shift away from academic. Boards campus activism, demanding things like relevant courses, separate ethnic studies departments with lower requirements, or affirmative grading, basically. Grading on a curve adjusted for group identity to hide the high failure rates.
So it becomes a systemic effort to treat the failure rate instead of addressing the cause, which is the mismatch created by unequal admission standards.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Sowell's fundamental moral critique, which kind of ties all these empirical findings together.
Okay, what's the core moral argument?
He sees the whole project of trying to compensate people today for wrongs done to groups in the past as fundamentally flawed. He calls it an act of symbolic expiation for historical sins.
Trying to make amends symbolically.
Right. But he argues this attempt inevitably creates new evils in the present. Sowell insists that the evils of the past, slavery, Jim Crow, caste oppression, remain indelibly and irrevocably evil. Nothing we do now can change that historical fact.
So trying to fix the past by creating group privileges today is misguided.
He argues it's worse than misguided. It's unjust. It ends up creating new injustices against individuals today, both those in the non-preferred groups who are disadvantaged by the policies, and even those in the preferred groups who are harmed by mismatching or the stigma of preference individuals who had absolutely nothing to do with the original historical wrongs.
So for Sowell, what does real justice require?
Impartial rules. Treating individuals as individuals based on their own merits and actions, not as members of a group entitled to special treatment or bearing collective guilt.
It's the difference between opportunity and entitlement.
That's a key distinction for him. Real progress comes from equal opportunity applying the same rules to everyone, allowing self-reliance, hard work, and education to pay off. Affirmative action, in his view, replaces that with group entitlement, which breeds dependency, resentment, and, as the global evidence suggests, social friction and conflict.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive into Sowell's global study really paints a stark picture. He looked at policies across India, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Malaysia, the US, all started with different justifications, different local histories.
Yet the results, the empirical consequences, were remarkably consistent and consistently negative in his analysis.
You see policies spreading, becoming permanent when they were meant to be temporary.
You see the benefits captured by elites within the preferred groups, not the poorest.
You see individual incentives weakened, skills devalued, honesty compromised through identity fraud.
And most worryingly, you see intergroup conflict escalating, fueled by the politicization of difference, sometimes even leading to riots and civil war.
The core message seems to be a warning about governing based on good intentions without understanding the predictable empirical consequences, a warning about a lack of knowledge and control.
Absolutely. The idea that you can engineer precise social outcomes through group preferences just doesn't hold up to the evidence, according to Sowell. He shows that disparities themselves aren't the main driver of conflict. It's the government stepping in and taking sides, politicizing those disparities, that really corrodes unity.
And the ultimate price, as we saw in places like Sri Lanka or with the tensions in India, can be incredibly high, measured in division, resentment, and sometimes, tragically, in blood.
When a society decides to abandon impartial rules, which are really the bedrock of individual liberty, and substitutes them with the shifting sands of collective privilege and perpetual group compensation, the inequalities of power and the social divisions that result seem to cost far, far more than whatever good intentions were behind them.
So Sowell's work leaves us with a pretty challenging thought.
It really does. Consider this. If his global evidence suggests that true equality can't be engineered by government decree, and that attempting to achieve fairness through group coercion often backfires, diminishing achievement and heightening conflict, then what forces, maybe political, maybe intellectual, maybe in the media in your own society, continue to push for these kinds of policies based almost purely on a moral rationale, often overlooking or dismissing the real-world turmoil they tend to generate? That's the tough question Sowell's empirical journey leaves us all to think about.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.